Michael Behe, I am so glad to meet you, and thank you for agreeing to do this. This is one of the rare times when I have actually initiated a Blogging Heads pairing, and it's because I just read your book, The Edge of Evolution, from 2007, and I found it absolutely shattering. I mean, this is a very important book, and yet I sense from the reputation or the reception of your book from 10 plus years ago, Darwin's Black Box, that it may be hard to get a lot of people to understand why the book is so important. So I just wanted to go back and forth with you for a little while to get a sense of what your intent with this book was and ask you a few questions and just allow this book to have the wide airing that it deserves. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Sounds great to me. It's nice to be with you. I've never been on a Blogging Heads before, so should be fun.
Yeah, it's I want to start with this, and this is what motivates me. Darwin is great. I've always been really interested in evolution. Usually on Blogging Heads I talk about race issues, but however, actually in my actual daily life I'm interested much more in certain other things, such as I'm a massive dinosaur fan and things like that. And evolution has always fascinated me, but I've always seen a certain kink in the whole natural selection argument. And I've always asked people this basic question. It's about skunks. So if the idea is that there is this random mutation, and that certain random mutations end up spreading throughout a population because they convey some sort of fitness, then you have to go step by step by step. And this is something that I learned in particular from your book, Darwin's Black Box, that all of these things have to happen incrementally. And I always thought to myself, with the skunk has this gland and this procedure where it shoots out this mist or this fluid that, makes things run away. Okay, but what were the intermediate steps? Presumably there was some weasel-like creature that did not have that ability. And it's easy to see how evolutionarily it would be advantageous to have that gland and to be able to squirt it at people. But what were the intermediate steps? How was it that there was some sort of proto-skunk where presumably it produced some tiny amount of malodorous chemical in its sweat in that part, and maybe just a hint of muscular tissue, and somehow this non-functioning proto-version of the scent squirter somehow helped that thing to propagate? What are the intermediate steps? And I always ask people this, and people start screaming at me that I'm implying that evolution is not responsible and that instead we're talking about God, and the whole discussion just gets derailed. Nevertheless, I think that it's a genuine question, and it's one that your book has me interested in examining further. So what is the basic premise of the edge of evolution? What do you mean by the edge of evolution?
Well, the edge of evolution is meant to imply what Darwinian processes can do and what they might not be able to do. I mean, I think it's clear. I certainly think that Darwinian processes can explain a lot of things like antibiotic resistance and maybe even, say, the white fur of a polar bear and things like that. I think most people would agree with that. But there are many things like the scent gland of a skunk where you don't know if this random change plus natural selection process is going to be able to cut the mustard, so to speak. And,
right.
And so the point of the edge of evolution is, well, do we have any data, do we have any studies that will actually help us to decide what Darwinism can do and what it can't do? And I kind of dubbed that the edge of evolution.
Exactly. And one of the basic premises of the book, and I want to get these premises out of the way first before we get to the question part, is that the Darwinian idea that there's common descent, that all the world's creatures have evolutionary relationships and develop from one another in some way, is clear, but that the problem is the notion that we have the difference between a skunk and an okapi and a tyrannosaurus, all based on random mutation, that random mutation could have created things like this. And go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's exactly right. Most people don't realize it, but Darwin's claim to fame wasn't just to suggest evolution in the sense of plain old common descent. His addition was the idea that this could happen completely without any mind or any guidance behind it. No plan, no design, nothing. Random mutation plus natural selection. so that things kind of so that life forms would just kind of blow with the wind in a sense. Nothing directional. Before Darwin, there were other scientists like, say, Lamarck, who postulated common descent, but they thought there was some teleology behind it, or some guidance, or some such thing. So the problem with Darwin's theory for many people, certainly myself, is that its mechanism, random mutation plus natural selection, just doesn't seem like it can get the job done.
Right, and one of the most interesting arguments in your book, and it bore careful reading, was that you can look at, say, malaria, how the malaria parasite has evolved, and malaria basically can beat our antidotes like chloroquine if there are many generations, many more generations than there can possibly have been for the evolution, say, of mammals, because these organisms are so numerous. And the way it does this is with two mutations that happen at the same time. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the chances of that happening are so infinitesimal and take so many generations. And that's about all that you can see when we actually watch organisms undergoing random mutation, rather than these magnificent things such as giraffes or even new protein combinations emerging. So your idea is that when we actually try to see random mutation happening, we don't really see very much. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's right. The big problem with Darwin's theory and evolution in general was that, you know, it was supposed to take so long, and so there were supposed to require so many generations of organisms and so many numbers of organisms that we wouldn't be able to see it within our lifetime, or even within recorded history. But in the past 20, 30 years, a lot of scientists have become interested in trying to do evolutionary studies on microorganisms, which you can grow in your laboratory in enormous numbers, or interested in microorganisms in nature, of which there are vastly more than, say, the large animals that we're used to thinking about that ever existed in history. So a fair test of evolution, instead of requiring, you know, large amounts of time, is to use large numbers of organisms like malaria, which is a little single-celled creature which causes sickness in humans, and see what they're able to do in a you know, tens of thousands of generations. And if they can't do very much, then we can easily say that, well, we won't be able to do more than that with fewer organisms, such as large animals such as humans or skunks or dinosaurs or whatever. Something else must be causing those changes.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that every 10 minutes there seems to be a book that comes out that you find in the science section at the store that purports to show that the sorts of questions that you're raising have been answered, that we've got it all figured out, how you get from an amoeba to Tom DeLay, you know, that we understand this. And so there's like Sean Carroll's book, but Endless Forms Most Beautiful, and then there's the one by the two guys whose name I forget. One of them's named Mark, The Plausibility of Life. Yes. These books always seem to purport to show how these sorts of things actually work. And what they'll show is that there is a gene or a set of genes that program for body segments or program for body parts, and that if you alter one of these genes, then you can make a leg grow out of something's head or something like that. And I have always waited for those books to prove to me that everything's been figured out. And I don't go into them skeptically, but they never really quite explain how you get from the amoeba to the triceratops. Why would you say that they don't? How come those books don't cinch the case?
Well, frankly, because we don't know. They think you have to separate our knowledge of how life works, of which we've learned an enormous amount in the past 50 years, learned about DNA and genes and other things, from the question of how life originated or how life changed over time. We know very, very little of that, and a lot of people, including many good scientists like Carroll and Kirshner and others, get confused. They think because they see a couple of different organisms that have similarities, then they can imagine it in their heads, moving some things around, and it wouldn't be any problem whatsoever. But they confuse what's going on in their own heads with what's going on in nature. And I think that's what's important about the edge of evolution, is because it really brings to the table data that's accumulated in the past decade or so about what random mutation and natural selection can actually do out in the wild, in nature. And as I write in the book, it's pretty small. As you alluded to, malaria, which is the major case that I look at in the book, grows in enormous numbers in the world. There are, in one infected person with malaria, there are about 1 trillion little organisms swimming around. A trillion is, something like 100 times the number of humans on the whole Earth.
Inconceivable, yeah.
And there's something like 1 billion people in the world get malaria every year.
Right.
So there's 10 to the 20th, 10 to the 21st, astronomical numbers of these things. And we've challenged them in the past couple decades with drugs, antibiotics, and they have been able to develop resistance to antibiotics. But when you go and ask yourself, well, what did they do? Did they develop some new sophisticated molecular machinery like the other molecular machines that are in the cell? And it turns out they make a few scratches, so to speak, on pre-existing machines, and that's barely enough to survive the drugs.
Exactly.
So they come up with these minuscule results. I think I say in the book that the Darwinian elephant labored mightily and gave birth to a gnat.
Right.
And the important thing is that this is observational data. It does not depend on somebody's imagination, like Professor Carroll's imagination or other Darwinian scientists who write their books. They can, they might think that some of these transitions would be easy, but we have absolutely no experimental or observational evidence to conclude that.
Yeah, and one more thing. My epiphany on this, when I remember I was sitting on a bed in a bed and breakfast looking out to sea and reading the chapter on proteins. That's when I realized, goodness gracious, something is really different from a certain skeptical, call it quote-unquote bright, a la Richard Dawkins, way of looking at the world. I thought, really, there is something going on. Talk about proteins and the way that they match or don't. This is something really important for people to realize in terms of figuring out how random mutation could even create a cell. Proteins are pretty weird, aren't they?
Well, they are weird in a sense. They're of course elegant too. What the problem is, most lay people think of the cell as kind of a squishy glob of Jell-O or something. But what modern science has showed that it's actually filled with these biological machines, which are composed mostly of things called proteins. And again, most people think of proteins as something you eat, but they're not. They're actually they're strings of chemicals called amino acids, which are put together. And as an analogy, you can think of the amino acids as letters. And when you put letters together in the right way, they can spell out words and sentences and so on. But if you put them together in the wrong way, they don't spell anything. They convey no meaning.
And the proteins make things happen by sticking to each other, by matching.
That's right. They're actually a lot more exotic than letters. They've got chemical properties where they have regions that are positively charged or negatively charged, and those regions can attract each other. And another region which might be like kind of an oily region, but another one which is kind of like salt, which likes to be dissolved in water. And all of these things make a string of amino acids fold up on itself in a particular way so that it assumes a shape like a machine. So suppose you had a piece of metal on the floor and it had little magnets on it, the north side pointing up on some and the south side pointing up on others, and all of a sudden it started to fold itself up and it formed scissors. And now you can use this folded up metal as a piece of scissors, but when it was unfolded on the floor, you could not do that. Well, proteins are like that. They form much more sophisticated machinery than scissors. They can do very exotic chemical reactions. They can build things in your body. The retina in your eye is composed of a protein called rhodopsin, which interacts with light and helps send a signal onto your brain to start vision. And the blood contains a protein called hemoglobin, which binds to oxygen and delivers it to tissue. So proteins it's like going into Home Depot and finding all of these machines, all of these tools around. Well, there are thousands and thousands of different proteins in your body. And because of their particular shapes, they can do all these different jobs.
And in any given cell, there are so very many proteins all jangling around in this blob, and they're somehow directed by DNA and RNA to create chemicals. They're just jangling around in this fluid, and they find one another, and the result is you and me doing this. And that's how evolution has happened. And yet, we're supposed to think that there's nothing miraculous about this process.
Yeah, it seems pretty easy to me.
Right. And it's fun to imagine it happening kind of step by step, but how this would go on. And so clearly, it's difficult to avoid a sense, and I think anybody, no matter how skeptical about, higher beings is, it's difficult to avoid there being at least an illusion of teleology here, that there seems to be something directing this, that it can't be completely random. Yeah. Because, for example, a Sean Carroll cannot tell you how these jangling bags of proteins and endoplasmic reticulum, etc., came together to create a leg in the first place. It's one thing to be able to figure out how a leg is placed in one place as opposed to another. But how did something even start to have the particular detailed leg in question, and how does that leg go from the fly's leg to our leg, and things like that. And so, it seems that, and this is something that you seem to understandably pull back from getting too specific about in the book, but correct me if I'm wrong, it would seem to me that your idea is that random mutation alone cannot explain these things, and that there must have been some sort of intelligent designer, and that intelligent designer, I presume, would be God, right?
Well, I certainly think so. I'm a run-of-the-mill Christian, but in the book, I try to act as, I'm a scientist, and the scientific evidence points to design. It doesn't. And there's no signature on the molecular machinery saying who did it. And if somebody else wants to think that it was a space alien or something exotic, well, they're free to do it. The structure of the molecular machines doesn't force you to believe one versus the other. But certainly, I think, and most, I think, theists will think that God is a major candidate for the role of designer.
Well, I will definitely say that in reading your book, I came closer than I ever have at the age of 43 to believing in God. I, quite frankly, do not and never have, and think the world is a marvelous place anyway. And I never imagined that anybody could even begin to convince me that there was such a thing. Reading your book, I thought to myself, I can't think of what there would be that would create this kind of order out of chaos. And I suspect that many people, if they actually read the book all the way through, would have the same response. But the fact is, and I say this with full respect for your religious beliefs, I don't want to believe in God. I don't like change. And so, after I finished your book, I could not help thinking, wow, suppose he's wrong, because after all, I'm not a biochemist, I'm not a biologist. Is this really a solid case? And so one question I wanted to ask is, What makes you so sure that we're just not in an intermediate point, which I'm sure is the objection of various biologists to theses such as yours, and that we'll figure these sorts of things out? Why do you think that we've hit a wall? How can you be so brave as to be so sure that you're not being premature? What is it that seems so completely irresolvable?
Well, you can never be completely sure in science. It's the nature of the discipline, and I never claim, and certainly don't now, that this is that I have some sort of logical proof for design and so on. But with science, you got to go with the evidence, where the evidence is pointing. And in my mind, it's clearly pointing strongly to design or something very similar to it. Now, let me give you an analogy to kind of show you my mindset. In the early part of the 1900s, 1930 or so, most physicists thought that the universe was eternal and unchanging, and that satisfied them just fine. But then the motion of galaxies away from each other and away from the Earth was noticed, and that was the start of the Big Bang hypothesis. And the Big Bang hypothesis at the time struck a lot of people, and still strikes a lot of people, including a lot of scientists, as having theological implications. Who knows? Maybe this was, the creation or some such thing. And a lot of scientists at the time didn't like this idea one bit.
Right.
So why didn't they just say, well, we don't like this idea. We can't. There might be some other explanation for it. So we'll just pass over this Big Bang hypothesis. We'll continue to think that the universe is eternal, and maybe some new idea will come along in 50 years, and we'll latch onto that. Well, if they had done that, they would be out of a lot of progress that science has made in the intervening time. And I view ideas the same thing. Who knows? You can never tell in science what's coming down the pipe. But right now, it sure looks this way to me, that things look strongly as if they were designed. And Darwinian claims notwithstanding, we have no idea how such elegant complexity could have come about without design. So why don't we make that conclusion, or at least as a hypothesis, and go from there?
I cannot believe that the typical view among scientists is such that they're not as fascinated by that question and this possible boundary to our knowledge that you are. It's so utterly fascinating. And yet I remember when Darwin's Black Box came out, I grabbed it. I was fascinated by this. It opened my eyes. And I had a scientist friend, eminent one. I will not name them or even give their gender, but I had that scientist over to dinner. And when I gave that scientist your book and said, have you read this one, that scientist literally, and they, yes, singular they, were being kind of theatrical, but they literally threw it across the room. They just could not entertain that this book, and it was gaining a reputation, could possibly be making any sense. But of course, that wasn't a discussion. I could not get this person to discuss what was so wrong with the ideas. Nevertheless, I'm sure that people like, Sean Carroll are scoffing at The Edge of Evolution, to the extent that he has actually read it. Certainly he feels that it's not even worth any kind of notice and that there are things you're leaving out, etc. Also, the book came out 2 years ago, and I imagine you probably wrote it in 2005. Science proceeds quickly. What do you think a Sean Carroll, and I'm using him as a stand-in for all of these Evo-Devo people who seem to think that they've got it all figured out, what would he say your mistake is? Because I'm sure you've thought about that. Where are you going wrong according to the conventional wisdom?
Well, let me just say that I know Sean Carroll. Sean Carroll is a friend of mine. And I just met him at a recent evolutionary biology meeting a couple months ago. He's a real nice guy.
So you two can have beer and interact.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk. He's a friendly fellow. But from his review, he reviewed the book for Science magazine. His objections to it were simply wrong. He talked about. I pointed out in the book how protein binding sites would be very difficult to get by random mutation and natural
Yeah.
selection. And he thought, well, this would be easy. All you have to do is make 2 amino acid changes or 1 amino acid change, and you'd have a brand new binding site. And
No.
but you can't do that. And what one sees when one looks at results such as the evolution of malaria in the wild is that his imagined new protein binding sites never show up. And neither do they show up in experimental evolutionary laboratories when people are growing bacteria and trying to make them change. So all of his objections were easily answered. The big problem I had with the review was the tone of scorn, as you said, the tone of scorn that was in it. Clearly, these are questions that we don't know about yet, and you might take the position, as a lot of people do, that, well, yeah, we don't know about it yet, but I'm not going down the design route. I don't think that's going to pan out. Well, okay, but to deny that Darwinism has these problems is kind of sticking your head in the sand.
Yes. Why don't people understand the role of randomness and chance? We must have evolved in some way not to understand that readily. Or here's another question. I remember way back in the late 90s, I discussed your book with another biologist, and they said something which I have since read, and I think which you mentioned in The Edge of Evolution, which is that a few of the irreducibly complex things that you discussed in the first book have been found since to not be as irreducibly complex. And so your idea that you stressed, particularly in Darwin's Black Box, was that there are certain very complex structures or processes in how organisms work where it's impossible to imagine what the intermediate step would have been, kind of like the skunk's scent gland and squirting process. And for example, one of them, and actually the one that gave me my epiphany in the first one, was blood coagulation. And you showed how there's this ridiculously Baroque process of this cascade of chemicals that all end up interacting in order to create a clot, and there couldn't be an intermediate stage of this that would have served any purpose. It wouldn't create a blood clot, and so why would this have evolved in any way? Now apparently it's been shown since then that there are ways of going step by step and creating blood clotting. And so I thought at that time, well, I guess they basically shot poor Michael Behe, down. I guess that takes care of his book. Apparently not, but how do you know there isn't going to be more of that in terms of, for example, this beautiful example that you give of the cilium, the hair-like structures, and how utterly complex they are, such that it's hard to imagine anybody building one of these even on purpose, much less it happening randomly step by step. How do you know that there isn't going to be more of that people aren't going to take each one of these processes you identify and find that there were intermediate steps like they did with the blood?
Well, I think what they're doing is that they're mistaking the idea of irreducible complexity. They're confusing what I think of as irreducible complexity with what they, with their own ideas. They think that the idea of irreducible complexity is that you can't make a machine that does something similar to the machine you're thinking about with fewer parts. But that's not true, and I wrote about that in Darwin's Black Box. I said, as an example of irreducible complexity in our everyday world, I talked about a mousetrap, which has a number of parts. It's got a metal spring and a bar that smacks the mouse and a couple of others. But you can make mousetraps a number of different ways. You can take a box and prop it open with a stick, and that's a simpler mousetrap. But the question is, can you get to the mousetrap that we're talking about by numerous successive slight modifications, which Darwin insisted on, very small, tiny steps, random steps that are favored by natural selection. And a number of machines, if they're complicated enough, they contain a number of different components. Let's talk about a car. It contains an air conditioner, a fuel pump, and so on. You might be able to use those things for other purposes, but if you take out a fuel pump from a car, the car is not going to work. So unfortunately, some people, kind of egged on by the Darwinists, have said, well, if we can find any use at all for some part of what I tagged an irreducibly complex system, then we can relieve our minds, we can declare it to be not irreducibly complex. But
Right.
I would disagree that the blood clotting system was shown to not be irreducibly complex, or was shown to not be irreducibly complex.
So you're saying that these intermediate steps that they've come up with functions for, those functions are somehow not valid, that those aren't realistic reconstructions as to what these intermediate...
In many cases, the functions are valid, but the question is, how do you get from one to the other by random mutation and natural selection? There's something called a bacterial flagellum. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's kind of like a little rotary motor, like an outboard motor.
Fascinating.
And I wrote about that in Darwin's Black Box and said it was irreducibly complex. And after the book came out, it was discovered that there was a subpart of it that could act kind of like a pump, kind of like the gas pump in your car. And some people said, well, if we take this away, it still works. Therefore, the flagellum is not irreducibly complex.
Okay.
But I counter that. Well, no, it is, because when you take away that part, the flagellum no longer works as a rotary motor. It's like taking away an axle or something from an outboard motor and saying I can use this axle over here. And somebody said, yes, but the outboard motor is broken. It doesn't work anymore. So it turns out that it's a lot harder than these folks are giving it credit to actually construct an irreducibly complex system. They're kind of trying to backward engineer things, and you can easily get misled by your imagination, as many Darwinists have throughout the past century or so.
And I should specify that you agree that random mutation could create things on the level of, say, a species. And so you're not denying that you can certainly see finches' beaks evolving on the basis of the Darwinian process. But your point is that we have no evidence that that process could create the difference between a finch and an anteater, and that something else must have been going on, especially because if that were going to happen, given how rare it is that we see mutations that actually convey some sort of advantage when we try to see it in the laboratory, there would have to have been a lot more time that the world had existed for there to be that kind of variety if it was conceivable at all. Is that a fair representation of your point?
Yeah, and the more you study it, I mean, if you look at the nuts, the molecular nuts and bolts of it all, the more I doubt that it could happen at all, because it turns out a lot of the helpful mutations, the kind that give you antibiotic resistance, or that change color in an organism's color and maybe help it fit into an environment better. A lot of those mutations are actually the breaking of pre-existing cellular machinery. And it's a lot easier to break something than it is to make something. And so I think that if Darwinian evolution proceeded over a long period unaided, well, the genomes, the information in the DNA of a lot of organisms would simply go south over time. So I don't think even given more time with just a Darwinian process, you'd be able to get from something simpler to something, from a finch to an anteater or whatever the progression was.
Right. And what's interesting about this, and I've wanted to ask you this in a way for over a decade, is, okay, let's say that random mutation, as we're taught, can only explain something which, frankly, I've always found a little boring and undramatic, like the finch's beaks. Like, I read the book about that. That was nice. But it's just these dull little birds and these minor beak variations. What I wanted to see was how some ugly shrew-like thing became all of today's mammals. How did that happen? And none of the science that we have now can explain it. And you're saying, basically, that except for boring little variations, this kind of shrew versus that kind of shrew, and who cares about shrews, that really it's intelligent design, let's say that it's God, and not what Darwin said. The problem with this is, and when I say that I don't want to believe in God, it's partly because of this. The problem with that is, isn't that a little dull? Like, a lot of people would say, well, you're just giving up. But, of course, you would say science is showing us that this is the way it is, and so too bad we do have to give up here. But nevertheless, aren't you implying that the process that takes us from some little multi-tuberculate to an armadillo to you and me, aren't you implying that that process is something that we just can't really know anything about? It's irreducibly complex, it's extremely complex, maybe we can describe it, but we can't go any further than that. We can't know how it developed. We can't know how God developed it. Is that the way to put it? I'm not accusing you of giving up, but doesn't that bore you a bit? Don't you find that a little frustrating? Doesn't it make your research a little bit inert?
Well,
If you understand.
Yeah, I do understand your objection. I've actually heard that before. There's a historian of science named Will Provine at Cornell, and that's his big objection. He says he thinks this is boring. Who cares? Somebody comes in and designs it. What's the fun of that?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, okay. And you say, well, science has to describe things the way they are. It'd be nice if the universe were the way we want it to be, but the job of science is to go out and figure it out. And actually, finding limits is really the part of all theories in science. I'll give you an example. How about Einstein's theory of relativity? He said that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. Well, now, isn't that boring? How come
Yes.
that stops research into how things can go faster than the speed of light and how we could get across galaxies in a split second? But nonetheless, that's apparently the way things are. And if he said, "Oh, well, you go ahead, but I'll bet against your experiment succeeding and getting things to go faster than the speed of light," we would understand it. The idea of the theory is to show you what's a good question and what's not a good question. Trying to find out what can go faster than the speed of light, according to Einstein, is not a good question to ask. And if you spend a lot of time there, you're probably going to be wasting your time. In the same way, intelligent design says a question like, how did an eyeball evolve by random mutation and natural selection, is just a bad question because it didn't happen that way. So let's spend our time trying to figure out how it did happen.
Well, I don't know. The anteater has this long tongue and it's sticky, and most animals don't. And that evolved somehow, and it's impossible to explain how that happened via random mutation, I assume, the muscles and the chemicals, etc. Your version would be, and I don't mean this in mockery, God made the proteins interact that way because God had some plan that there would be this peculiar toothless creature with that tongue. And there it goes. Now that, I respect that. If that's really the way it is, then it's important for a scientist being empirical to understand that that's the way it was. And there's a part of me that wants to accept that and think, well, the reason that people believe in God and that people still do, that all of this is justified. There really is something larger than chemical interactions, and isn't that absolutely fascinating? That's fun in a way. Novelty can be striking, but doesn't it make you also want to figure out what that something more is and hope that it would be something scientific? I mean, clearly it taxes our imagination. It taxes our ability to conceive of things. It's almost like imagining a fourth dimension. But do you find it really impossible that we might, in 50 years or 100 years, crack some kind of code that would explain the evolution of this kind of complexity? And it should be said that complexity theory, which you flag in your book, of the Kaufman type, does not explain these sorts of things. So that does not cover it. But are you quite sure that there isn't something miraculous? And don't you tremble at the notion of finding that science can go further? Are you not giving up because of maybe an initial belief that you already had that there was a puppeteer up there?
No, I'm not giving up at all. At least that's not the way I see it. I see it as a positive thing. It's not my. I'm a religious guy. But I used to think Darwinian evolution was true. It wasn't until about 20 years ago, when I was 36 at the time, that I decided Darwinian evolution didn't do everything. I was taught Darwinian evolution in parochial schools. I'm a Catholic, so I I could live with theistic evolution, as a number of scientists do, and as a matter of fact, I used to think that was true, but now I just don't think it explains the data. I'm not trying to justify a belief in God or any such thing. I'm a biochemist. I want to know where these complex molecular machines came from, and it sure doesn't look like they came from a Darwinian process. And from everything I can tell, they have properties that are very similar to design systems in our own world, and so I just think it's a good hypothesis that that they were designed. If in 50 years somebody comes along with a better idea and shows that, well, no, there's this complex thing that we never thought of, and it doesn't involve design.
Imagine.
Well, then bless their heart. Then they win. Okay, but that's the way science is. But you can't ignore something because it seems philosophically unpalatable.
Definitely not.
And science will get in trouble a whole lot quicker, I think, that way than if it discovers something that seems to put some limit on nature, as most theories do.
Yeah. Just out of random curiosity, are you going to spend the rest of your active career engaged in showing us things that cannot be explained according to the theory, or is there another aspect of your research? My question is, what is your research if you don't believe in what so many other people believe in?
Well,
that's a genuine question.
Well, it's essentially along the lines of the edge of evolution. If you think that some things are designed like I do, but if you think not everything's designed like I do, then where's a good place to draw this edge? Kind of characterizing nature is a classical scientific activity.
Okay.
In the 17, 18, 1900s, chemists would go out and try to find what elements there were. They just wanted to see what was there. Astronomers would survey the skies, see what planets were there. Well, one can ask oneself what design things are here in life and what did not require design, just to kind of get the lay of the land. And once we have the lay of the land, then maybe we would be in a better position to go and ask further questions. But right now, I think we have to do that first before going on and trying to figure out some way in which a designer might work, or whether something besides design is called for.
This is an achingly urgent question. I cannot get enough of it. You know what? I'm going to become a biochemist. I almost mean that. I'm going to start at the very beginning and get a degree because I want to work on this. It would be so interesting if it really turned out that we had hit the wall that you're talking about. And I'm open to the possibility, but boy, what a miracle it would be if we could figure out what the other part is. But you have convinced me completely that the basic Darwin with the beard story, the random mutation, that won't do. And the people who are going to scoff at your work, I highly suspect, and this is a completely irresponsible and arrogant thing for me to say as someone who's not a scientist, I don't think that they're reading you carefully enough. It sounds like they're people who are not thinking about what you're saying. And I regret it because I really do believe The Edge of Evolution is one of the most important books I have read in my entire life. And I hope that other people will actually take the book and read it all the way through. And 45 minutes is about the best length for blogging heads, and we have about hit that. Okay. And so, is there anything else that you wanted to get in before we closed, by the way?
Here's one thing, is that a lot of people object to evolution because of their religious values, but you don't have to. You can object to evolution or Darwinian evolution simply on scientific grounds, and that's what I'm trying to do. And as you've read, there's plenty of reason to do so.
Wow, I chose the wrong career. Thank you very much, Michael. This was absolutely illuminating.
My pleasure. Thank you, John.
And I hope we talk again someday. Thanks.